this episode, we're going to focus on what happens after a person says yes, no, or not anymore, because privacy does not stop at the moment data is collected. In real life, people change their minds, their situations change, and sometimes they realize they never wanted a certain kind of processing in the first place. A strong privacy program has to handle consent and preference changes in a way that is clear, consistent, and operationally real, not just polite words on a website. The title points us to three related actions: withdrawal, objection, and restriction. Withdrawal is when someone takes back consent they previously gave. Objection is when someone says they do not want processing to continue, often in contexts where the organization relies on a legal basis other than consent. Restriction is when processing is limited in certain ways, such as pausing use while something is verified, rather than fully stopping or deleting the data. These can sound similar, and beginners often treat them as one thing, but they are different operations with different impacts on systems and processes. Handling them well requires good notices, reliable routing, accurate identity handling, and strong record keeping so the organization can prove it honored the choice. By the end, you should be able to describe how these changes work operationally and why they are central to trust in a privacy program. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful foundation is understanding the difference between consent and preferences, because people use these words casually, but in privacy operations they can mean different things. Consent is a specific kind of permission that must be freely given, informed, and specific for certain types of processing in many frameworks. Preferences are broader choices a person expresses, such as marketing opt-outs, cookie settings, or communication frequency, and while they may not always be called consent legally, they still create obligations because they represent the person's expectations. Operationally, both consent and preferences act like instructions that the organization must follow. The main operational challenge is that these instructions need to be captured accurately, stored reliably, and enforced consistently across all the places where data is used. If a person withdraws consent for marketing emails but still receives them, the program fails, regardless of how good the policy language is. If a person objects to certain profiling but the profiling continues quietly in analytics pipelines, the program fails, even if no one sends them a message. This is why consent and preference changes are not just a user interface issue. They are a data governance issue that touches systems, processes, and sometimes vendors. For beginners, the key mindset shift is that a choice is a control, and controls must be enforced. Withdrawal of consent is usually the easiest to understand conceptually because it is the clearest statement. I gave permission, now I take it back. The operational rule is that withdrawal should be as easy as giving consent, meaning you should not design withdrawal as a complicated obstacle course. Withdrawal should also be processed promptly, because people expect it to take effect quickly, and many legal regimes require timely action. Withdrawal has a crucial nuance, which is that it typically applies going forward, not backward, meaning it stops future processing based on consent, but does not automatically erase the fact that processing occurred in the past. That said, withdrawal often triggers other actions, such as stopping communications, removing the person from certain audiences, and potentially deleting or minimizing data where there is no other lawful reason to keep it. Operationally, withdrawal means you need to update a consent record, ensure the update propagates to all systems that rely on that record, and prevent recollection of consent in a manipulative way. It also means you need to handle cases where consent was bundled with other choices, because bundled consent can create confusion when someone wants to withdraw only part of it. A well-run program designs consent categories in a way that makes withdrawal meaningful and manageable. For beginners, the important lesson is that withdrawal is not just flipping a switch, it is ensuring the switch controls the whole circuit. Objection is different from withdrawal because it often arises when the organization is not relying on consent in the first place. Objection is the person saying, I do not want you to continue this processing, and the organization must evaluate whether it has a strong enough justification to continue. In many regimes, objection is especially relevant for processing based on legitimate interests, certain public interest grounds, or direct marketing. Operationally, objection handling is not just an automatic stop in every case, because the organization may need to assess the context, the purpose, and whether there are overriding reasons to continue. This is where programs need clear decision rules, because without rules, decisions become inconsistent and feel unfair. For direct marketing, objection is often treated as a hard stop, because continuing marketing after objection undermines trust quickly. For other processing, objection might trigger a review, where the organization considers necessity, impact, and safeguards, and decides whether processing can continue, must be limited, or must stop. That review should not be endless, because the person's request needs a timely response. It should also produce a clear outcome communicated in plain language, with reasons. For beginners, the key is that objection is a request for the organization to justify itself, not a mere preference toggle, and operations must support that justification process. Restriction sits in between, and it is often the most misunderstood because it sounds like a vague limitation rather than an action. Restriction means limiting processing in specific ways, often temporarily, while something is clarified or resolved. For example, if a person disputes accuracy, restriction might mean pausing use of the data until it is corrected. If a person objects and the organization is evaluating the objection, restriction might mean pausing certain processing during the evaluation. Restriction can also mean limiting processing to storage, meaning the data is kept but not used for certain purposes. Operationally, restriction is challenging because it is not always a complete stop, and partial stops are harder to implement than full stops in complex systems. You need to know which processing activities must be blocked and which can continue, and you need to enforce that consistently across systems and vendors. Restriction also requires strong tracking, because temporary measures can become permanent if no one follows up. A restriction should have a clear trigger, a defined scope, and a defined review point, so it does not become a silent loophole. For beginners, it helps to think of restriction as putting data into a protected state, where it cannot be used for certain actions until a condition is met. These three operations depend on a set of shared building blocks that make them reliable: identity handling, intake and routing, preference storage, propagation, and verification of effect. Identity handling matters because you should not change a person's preferences based on a request from someone else, especially when those preferences control sensitive processing. Intake and routing matter because requests can arrive through many channels, and the organization needs to capture them consistently and route them to the right systems and teams. Preference storage matters because you need a single source of truth, or at least a consistent way to reconcile multiple sources, so systems do not disagree about what the person wants. Propagation matters because a preference change must reach all relevant processing locations, including third parties who act on the organization's behalf. Verification of effect matters because without it, you do not know whether the stop, restriction, or objection outcome actually happened in practice. Many privacy failures occur because the preference is recorded but not enforced, or enforced in one place but not in others. A mature program treats preference handling as a system, not as a set of isolated checkboxes. For beginners, the key is that operations are about consistency across the whole data ecosystem, not about one screen or one database. Notices and communication are also essential because people need to understand what their choice means and what will happen after they make it. If a person withdraws consent, the notice should explain what processing will stop and whether any processing will continue under a different basis, such as necessary service operations. If a person objects, the notice should explain what will happen next, whether processing will pause, how long evaluation might take, and what kind of response they will receive. If a person requests restriction, the notice should explain what is being restricted, what uses will stop, and what will still occur, such as storage or necessary operations. Communication should avoid vague promises, because vague promises create disappointment and complaints. It should also avoid manipulative wording that pressures the person to reverse their choice, because that undermines trust and can create legal risk. A good program uses straightforward language and confirms changes, so the person knows the request was processed. It should also provide a way for the person to update preferences again, because preferences are not one-time decisions. For beginners, it helps to remember that notice is part of the control, because a choice is only meaningful when the person understands it. Record keeping is the accountability layer for consent and preference changes, and it is more important than it first appears because these changes often become disputed later. A person might say they never consented, or they withdrew and the organization continued processing, or they objected and still received communications. Record keeping should capture what choice was made, when it was made, how it was expressed, and what scope it covered. For withdrawal, records should show the prior consent state, the withdrawal timestamp, and the systems or processing affected. For objection, records should show the objection received, the evaluation path taken if applicable, the decision and reasoning, and the resulting actions. For restriction, records should show the restricted state, what uses were paused, and what condition will end the restriction. Record keeping should also capture propagation evidence, especially when vendors are involved, showing that third parties received the instruction and acted on it. Records should be designed to minimize unnecessary personal data, but they must still be sufficient to prove what happened. This is a balancing act, because keeping too little makes accountability weak, and keeping too much creates new risk. For beginners, the main point is that preference changes are legal and trust commitments, so they must be provable commitments. One of the hardest operational challenges is dealing with conflicts and timing, because systems do not always update instantly and requests can overlap. A person might withdraw consent and then submit an access request or object while also requesting restriction, or change preferences multiple times in a short period. The program needs clear rules for precedence and effective time, meaning which instruction applies if there are multiple instructions. It also needs to handle propagation delays, where one system updates quickly and another updates later, creating temporary inconsistency. A mature program anticipates these realities and builds controls like temporary holds, reconciliation routines, and confirmation steps for high-impact changes. It also avoids designs that require too many systems to interpret preferences independently, because that increases the chance of conflicting behavior. Another timing issue is communications already in motion, like a message that was queued before the withdrawal arrived. A well-designed process has rules for what happens in those cases and communicates realistically with the individual. For beginners, this is a reminder that privacy operations live in real systems with real latency, and the goal is to design for that rather than pretending everything is instant. Vendors and contractors add complexity because they often execute marketing, analytics, support, or hosting functions that depend on personal data. When a person withdraws consent or objects, the organization may need to instruct vendors to stop processing for certain purposes, and it needs evidence that they complied. This is why vendor contracts and monitoring connect directly to consent and preference operations. If the vendor cannot implement preference changes reliably, the organization inherits risk even if its internal systems work perfectly. A strong program ensures that the ability to honor preferences is considered when vendors are selected and that obligations are clear for processing instructions. It also ensures that preference changes are communicated through consistent channels and that vendors confirm receipt and action. For restriction, vendor handling can be especially challenging because partial limitations require more nuance than a simple stop. This is why restriction should be scoped carefully and tracked diligently. For beginners, the important takeaway is that honoring preferences is an end-to-end responsibility, not limited to internal databases. The organization is accountable for the whole chain. As we wrap up, handling consent and preference changes well is about turning a person's choice into a reliable operational instruction that the organization follows consistently. Withdrawal ends processing that depended on consent and requires timely, easy execution and strong propagation across systems. Objection demands that the organization either stop certain processing, especially in marketing contexts, or evaluate and justify continuation in a structured, fair way with a clear response. Restriction limits processing in defined ways, often temporarily, and requires careful scoping, tracking, and enforcement across systems and vendors. All three depend on the same operational foundations: accurate identity handling, clear intake and routing, consistent preference records, propagation to every processing point, verification that the change took effect, and record-keeping that supports accountability. When these foundations are weak, people's choices become symbolic, and symbolic privacy is not privacy. When they are strong, the program can honestly say it respects people's control over their data. For brand new learners, the most important mindset is that preference handling is not a marketing feature. It is a core privacy control that must function reliably under messy, real-life conditions.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.